There is a particular kind of silence that fills a house when you are no longer truly welcome in it. Not the peaceful silence of a Sunday morning, not the comfortable quiet of a home at rest. This silence has edges. It follows you down hallways. It sits across from you at breakfast. It fills the space where your name used to be spoken with warmth and now is spoken when it is spoken at all with the careful clipped tone people use when discussing a problem they have not yet found the courage to solve. Ruth Calloway had lived inside that silence for the better part of a year. She had noticed it first in small things. The way Vivian stopped asking her opinion about dinner. The way Daniel would glance at his phone when she began a sentence, his eyes drifting before she had finished her thought. The way the grandchildren, teenagers, now absorbed in their own bright worlds, had slowly stopped wandering into the kitchen where she sat in the mornings with her tea. She was 75 years old. She had buried a husband, raised a son alone, through years that had no softness, in them worked two jobs when one wasn't enough, and sold the home she had lived in for 30 years, the home with the elm tree she had planted herself. Home where Daniel had taken his first steps on hardwood floors, she had refinished with her own hands. She had sold all of it, every memory pressed into those walls to help Daniel and Vivian, when Daniel's consulting firm nearly collapsed under its own weight 4 years ago. They had promised it was temporary. She had believed them because he was her son, and that is what you do. The house she moved into was not the house she remembered visiting for holidays. That house had been warm and slightly cluttered and full of cooking smells. In the 3 years since Daniel's business recovered, and more than recovered, thrived, expanded into something sleek and profitable, the house had been remade entirely. Walls came down, new ones went up. The kitchen was replaced with something out of a design magazine, all white marble and matte black fixtures. The furniture changed twice. The yard was professionally landscaped with plants that were beautiful but somehow lifeless, chosen for appearance rather than growth. And Ruth, with her handmade Afghans and her habit of leaving gardening books on the coffee table and her tendency to move through rooms slowly, thoughtfully, as people do when they have learned that time is not something to be wasted, rushing Ruth had begun to feel like the one thing in the house that didn't fit the new design. She was 75 years old and she was being quietly made to understand that she was out of style. The morning it happened was a Tuesday in April. The kind of April morning that makes you believe the world is still capable of grace. Pale gold light coming through the windows, a faint smell of cut grass from somewhere down the street, the particular stillness of early spring that feels like a held breath before something begins. Ruth was already at the kitchen table when Daniel and Vivian came in together. She noticed immediately that they were wearing the same expression, carefully neutral, prepared. The expression people wear when they have rehearsed what they are about to say and want it to come out clean. She wrapped both hands around her mug of tea and waited. Daniel sat down across from her. Vivian took the chair beside him, slightly back, as though positioning herself as support rather than equal participant, a small staging choice that Ruth noticed and filed away. "Mom, we've been thinking about your situation." She didn't answer. She had learned in 75 years that silence was sometimes the most powerful response available to a person. The house, Daniel continued, has some different needs now that the business is expanding. He spoke in the tone she recognized from his business calls, the measured cadence of a man who had decided the outcome before the conversation began and was now simply walking the other party toward it. "We've been working with a contractor about the space and the room you're in. It's really the only room that works as a proper home office. Private entrance from the hallway, good natural light." Ruth looked at him steadily. She said nothing. Vivian leaned forward slightly. "There are some wonderful places, Ruth. We've done research. There's one in Farmington Meadowbrook Senior Living. It has its own garden activities meal service. You'd have a studio apartment, your own space. People your own age. I have my own age," Ruth said. "It comes with me everywhere I go." Neither of them smiled. "We worry about you," Daniel said. "Being here alone during the day when we're working. What if something happened? What if you fell?" Ruth set down her mug with a precision that was deliberate and quiet. "You haven't worried about that in 3 years. Mom." She looked at her son, really looked at him. She thought about the boy who had cried at his father's funeral at the age of 9 and held her hands so tightly she could feel the small bones of his fingers pressing into her palm. She thought about the young man she had driven to college with everything he owned, packed into the back of her car, crying herself on the drive home because the house felt too big and too quiet. She thought about the phone calls when his business was failing, the sound of fear in his voice, the way he had said mom like it was the only word he knew that still meant something solid. She thought about the check she had written, the house she had sold. And she looked at this man sitting across from her now, with his prepared expression and his contractor and his home office plans, and she understood something that settled in her chest like cold water. He had already decided. This was not a conversation. It was a notification. She said quietly, "What happened to my mother's property?" The shift in the room was immediate. Daniel and Vivian exchanged a glance, fast, involuntary, the kind of glance that communicates more than words. "That old place," Daniel said. "It's nothing, Mom. It's an abandoned farmhouse and 40 acres of overgrown fields in Franklin County. We couldn't even give it away when we were handling Grandma Lorraine's estate. The property taxes alone are barely worth paying, but it's still in my name. Technically, yes. But you can't. Seriously, I want to go there," Ruth said. "Instead of Meadowbrook. I want to go to my mother's property." There was a silence that was different from the one Ruth had been living inside for months. This silence was sharp. "Mom," Daniel's voice was careful now, careful in a new way. "That property has no electricity, no running water. The house is probably structurally compromised. You cannot live there alone at 75. That's not independence. That's not safe." "Then I'll make it safe." "Ruth," Vivian spoke her name like a period at the end of a sentence. "You need appropriate care. You need supervision. I spent 30 years raising your husband without supervision," Ruth said. "I managed." The silence that followed was longer. Then Daniel leaned forward and his voice changed again, became something harder, something she hadn't heard before, something she would think about for a long time afterward. "Mom, I need you to understand something. If you make a decision that puts you in danger, if you refuse appropriate care and something happens, we have an obligation. As your family, there are legal options available to us for your protection." Ruth was very still. "What kind of legal options?" she said. "Guardianship," Vivian said. "It's a standard process. It just means that decisions about your living situation, your care." Ruth stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She was 75 years old, and she had lived through things that had required every kind of strength she possessed, and she was done performing powerlessness for people who had chosen to see her as powerless. "Let me be very clear," she said. "You are threatening to take my legal right to make my own decisions, not because you are afraid for me, but because you want me to go quietly where it is convenient for you." She looked at her son. "I know the difference, Daniel. I have known you your whole life." He started to speak. She raised one hand and he stopped. "I will be out by the end of the week. I will go to my mother's property because it is mine, and I choose to go there. You do not need to help. You do not need to visit. Consider your obligation fulfilled." She walked out of the kitchen. She climbed the stairs to her room. She closed the door behind her and sat on the edge of her bed in the morning light, and for a long moment she simply breathed. Then she began to pack. She worked slowly and methodically the way she had always worked, without waste of motion. She folded her clothes and placed them in her two good suitcases. She wrapped the photograph of her husband in a flannel shirt. She packed her gardening books, her knitting, the small wooden jewelry box her mother Lorraine had given her decades ago. She took the things that were hers and left everything else exactly as it was, and in the leaving, she felt something she had not expected. She felt the first distant edge of relief. It was on the third day, the morning she was to leave, that she found it. She had gone back to the kitchen for one final sweep, not because she had forgotten anything, but because she was not the kind of woman who left a room without looking back at it. She opened the kitchen drawer where Daniel kept household documents, looking for the utility information she thought she might need to transfer. And there, beneath a folder of insurance papers, was a printed sheet of paper. An email chain. She almost didn't read it. It wasn't addressed to her. But the subject line caught her eye, and she read it before she fully understood what she was doing. The email was from a company called Agricor Inc. It was addressed to Daniel Calloway. It was dated 11 months ago. She stood at the kitchen counter and read it twice. Agricor was a large agricultural development corporation. The email was detailed, professional, carefully worded. It referenced the parcel of land in Franklin County, Ohio, specifically 41 acres currently held in the estate of Lorraine Calloway, deceased. It noted that federal highway planning documents indicated a new interstate connector would pass within 2 miles of the property within a projected 3-year timeline, significantly increasing land value and development potential for the corridor. Agricor was prepared to offer $800,000 for immediate acquisition, with the understanding that the transaction be completed before the highway route became public record. The email ended with a personal note from the regional acquisitions director. Given the estate status of the property and the absence of active management, we believe this timeline is achievable. We look forward to your response. There was no reply visible, but the email had been printed, filed, kept. Ruth set the paper down on the counter with a hand that was completely steady. She looked out the window at the professionally landscaped yard at the plants chosen for appearance rather than growth. He had known. He had known for nearly a year that her mother's land was worth something significant. He had said nothing. He had left it categorized as worthless in the estate documents. He had made sure she never thought twice about it. And then when the timing aligned, when the window before public announcement of the highway route was narrowing, he had begun making plans to clear the one obstacle standing between him and an uncontested transaction. Her. Ruth picked up the paper, folded it carefully, and put it in her coat pocket. She finished her sweep of the kitchen. She carried her last bag to the front door. Earl Braddock was already in the driveway with his pickup truck engine idling. Earl was 62, a former electrician, a man who had lived 3 houses down for 15 years and possessed that particular brand of quiet competence that makes a person indispensable without their ever seeking to be. His wife had brought Ruth casseroles in the first weeks after Gerald died. Earl himself had helped Ruth figure out the thermostat controls when Daniel changed the system without explaining it to her. He had called Ruth the evening before and said simply, "I heard you're moving out. I'll have the truck there at 8." She hadn't asked how he heard. In neighborhoods like this one, some information travels on its own. He loaded her bags without comment. He looked at the house once, looked at Ruth, and said nothing that needed to be said. They drove away from Hartford on a morning that was still beautiful, still gold, and still smelling of spring, and Ruth did not look back. The drive to Franklin County took just under 4 hours. Ruth spent most of it looking out the window at the landscape changing, the dense Connecticut suburbs giving way to wider roads, then to small towns, then to the flat and patient Ohio countryside, still brown at the edges with late winter, but showing the first faint greening of fields that were waking up. She had not been to her mother's property in nearly 40 years. She had visited as a child, summers spent in those fields, her grandmother Agnes teaching her the names of plants, the smell of the kitchen after canning, the sound of the screen door in the evenings. But her mother Lorraine had been the last one living there, and when Lorraine died 5 years ago, Ruth had been consumed with grief and the logistics of loss, and the property had been handled by the estate attorneys Daniel had arranged, and she had signed what she was told to sign and trusted that it was being properly managed. She understood now with a clarity that had no anger in it, yet only cold, clean recognition that trust had been misplaced. The roads narrowed as they went. Paved highway became county road. County road became gravel. Gravel became a rutted dirt track flanked by trees that pressed close on both sides, branches scraping the roof of Earl's truck as they pushed through. It felt like the road was being swallowed as they drove it. And then the trees opened. Earl slowed the truck to a stop and they both looked at what was there. The farmhouse was 2 stories. It had once been white. You could still see traces of white in the grooves of the weathered wood, like a memory the house was trying to hold on to. The shutters hung at wrong angles. The porch sagged on one side. Vines had claimed most of the south wall and were reaching across the windows, and the yard, if you could still call it that, had become something beyond overgrown chest-high weeds and tangled brush, through which the remnants of an old garden fence surfaced like bones. Behind the house, barely visible through the undergrowth, a barn leaned with the particular resignation of a structure that had made its peace with the ground it was returning to. It was desolate. It was overwhelming. It was hers. Earl let out a long, slow breath. Mrs. Calloway. Ruth was already opening the door. They worked together for 2 hours, unloading her things onto the porch. Earl helped her force open the front door, swollen with decades of moisture. It took both of them, and they stood together in the doorway and looked into the dim interior. The house smelled of time and dust, and something else beneath those things, something Ruth recognized without being able to name, a deep structural smell like wood and earth that meant the bones of the place were still sound. The furniture was covered in old sheets. The floors were hardwood, warped in a few places but intact. The stone fireplace at the center of the front room was unmoved, unchanged exactly as it had always been. It was underneath its long neglect, still a good house. It had simply been waiting. Earl said he could come back in the morning with supplies. He offered 3 times for her to come home with him for the night. She declined 3 times, and when he finally accepted her answer, he handed her a satellite phone. He had pulled from the truck without explanation and said, "You call me at any hour, I mean it." She watched his taillights disappear down the dirt track, and then she stood alone on the porch of her mother's house in the early evening and listened to what the land sounded like. It sounded alive. Somewhere in the overgrowth, something moved, small, unhurried belonging here, in a way that Ruth was only beginning to claim. A bird she couldn't identify called once from the tree line and went quiet. The sky was going from gold to deep blue, with no city lights to dull the transition, and the stars, when they began to appear, were more than she had seen in years, poured across the dark in numbers that made the sky feel close and vast at the same time. She ate cold food from a tin she had brought in her bag. She sat on the porch steps with her coat pulled around her shoulders, and she thought about the email in her pocket, and she thought about Daniel's face at the kitchen table, and she thought about the 30 years in a house with an elm tree and hardwood floors she had refinished herself. She thought about her mother, Lorraine, who had spent her last years here in these rooms on this land. Lorraine had been a quiet woman, a woman who held things carefully. Ruth had never thought to ask what she held. She thought about her grandmother, Agnes, whose handwriting she still remembered, the looping, careful cursive of a woman who had wanted everything recorded precisely. She slept that night on the old couch in the front room in her sleeping bag with the satellite phone on the cushion beside her. The house made sounds around her that were not alarming, the sounds of settling of wood adjusting to the night air, of a structure finding its equilibrium after a long solitude. She lay in the dark and listened, and somewhere between thought and sleep she registered something that had not been present in Daniel's house for a long time: the absence of the need to be smaller. She was not in anyone's way here. She did not need to move quietly around the edges of someone else's life. She was lying in the center of her own life, in a house that was hers, on land that was hers, making no apologies for occupying space. She slept better than she had in a year. The morning came with birds, an impossible chorus of them, loud and various and completely indifferent to her presence, which felt correct. Ruth woke stiff from the couch. 75 was not 25, and the body kept its own accounting. But she woke with something that surprised her in its intensity. She woke wanting to see what she had. She spent the first day in careful inventory, room by room inside the house. The front room, the kitchen, the dining room, the bathroom on the ground floor, all intact, all salvageable. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms and another bath. A long hallway where the light came in, slanted and pale through windows fogged with dust. The roof showed water stains in 2 places manageable. The plumbing was dead. The electrical had never been modernized and was therefore simply absent. Outside, she walked the perimeter of what had once been cultivated land. The fields were reclaimed wilderness weeds and volunteer saplings, and the creeping takeover of a landscape left without direction. But Ruth had gardened her whole life. She had learned to read soil from Lorraine, and Lorraine had learned from Agnes, and what Ruth saw in this land was not defeat. The soil showed dark where she scraped back the surface growth. Rich, not exhausted, the weeds were healthy, which meant the land beneath them was alive. Water pulled toward the low northeast corner, suggesting a spring or good drainage. The overgrowth was aggressive, but not permanent. She was examining the back corner of the property, the farthest reach of what had been the kitchen garden, tucked behind the remains of a fence that had given up pretending to be useful when she saw it. 3 circles in the earth. Recent. The soil around them disturbed and then smoothed over, but not skillfully. You could still see where the original surface had been displaced and replaced. 6 inches across each bore, the kind made by a soil sampling drill. She looked at the ground for a long moment. Then she looked at the fence gate. The gate had a padlock. The padlock was old. But the U-bolt where it had attached to the post had been sheared clean through, not broken with age, but cut with something deliberate. Fresh metal gleamed at the cut edge, untarnished. She walked back to the barn. On the soft ground beside the barn's east wall, preserved in the dampness of a spot that caught morning shade, she found the tire tracks. Wide, aggressive tread, Not the track of a farm vehicle or a light truck. Heavy equipment. The kind of vehicle a company sends when it wants to know what it's buying before it makes the offer. Agricor had not simply sent an email. They had sent people. They had been here on this land, her land, without her knowledge, without her consent, while she was still living in Daniel's house, still unaware that any of this was in motion. They had sampled the soil. They had assessed the property. They had confirmed whatever they needed to confirm. And then they had tried to buy it before she ever had the chance to know its value. Ruth Calloway stood in the long grass beside her grandmother's barn on a cool Ohio morning, with tire tracks at her feet and the smell of early spring in the air, and she felt something clarify inside her, the way water clarifies when you stop disturbing it and simply let it settle. She was 75 years old. She had been pushed out of her son's house. She had been deceived about what she owned. She was standing in an overgrown field with no electricity and no running water, and 2 suitcases and a satellite phone. And she was not going to the Meadowbrook Senior Living Facility. She was not going anywhere. She walked back to the house the same way she had arrived, steadily, without hurry, placing each foot with the certainty of a woman who has decided where she stands. The first 3 weeks on the property were about survival, and Ruth was honest enough with herself to use that word without drama. Survival meant water. There was no running water in the house, and the pipes, when Earl traced them on his second visit, had corroded through in 3 separate places along the main line. But Agnes had noted in the property documents, old documents Ruth found in a kitchen drawer, folded and soft at the creases, that there was a natural spring in the low northeast corner of the lawn, the same corner where Ruth had noticed the soil pulling wet. Earl found it in an afternoon, cleared the overgrowth around it, and pronounced it clean and consistent. Ruth filtered everything carefully and boiled what she drank, and it was enough. Survival meant warmth. April in Franklin County could still cut cold at night, and the house held the chill of its long vacancy in its walls, the way old wood holds everything, slowly releasing what it had absorbed over years. Ruth found a cast-iron stove in the back room beneath a canvas cover, intact and functional, and Earl got it drawing properly within a day. She burned wood. She split herself in shorter sessions than she might have at 50, but sessions she did not skip. Survival meant light and power. Earl installed a small generator and a single run of solar panels along the south-facing barn roof, a modest system enough to run 1 circuit and charge what needed charging, and Ruth learned to work with it the way she learned to work with everything, by paying attention. These were not small things. At 75, managing them alone required a daily recalculation of energy and effort, a budgeting of physical capacity that she had never needed to do so consciously before. She learned her own rhythms again. She learned what she could accomplish in a morning before fatigue began to collect at the back of her knees and the base of her spine. She learned to rest without guilt, which was harder than the work itself, and she began methodically to clear the land. She started with the area immediately surrounding the house, 10 feet, then 20, then the path to the barn. She cut back vines with long-handled shears. She pulled weeds with a fork she found in the barn's remaining dry section, its tines still sound. She worked 2 hours in the morning, rested through the midday warmth, worked another hour in the late afternoon. It was slow. It was unglamorous. It was the most purposeful she had felt in years. Her hands blistered through the first week. By the second week, the blisters had hardened into calluses, her working hands returning from wherever they had been during 3 years in Daniel's house, with its clean countertops and its professionally maintained everything. Daniel called on a Wednesday evening 3 weeks after she'd left. She was sitting on the porch in the last light, eating from a can of soup she'd heated on the camp stove, watching a red-tailed hawk ride a thermal above the east field. The satellite phone buzzed on the step beside her. She looked at his name on the screen for a moment. Then she answered. He told her she had made her point, that she could come home, that they would work something out. She told him this was her home. He told her she couldn't possibly sustain this. He asked about winter. He asked about illness. He listed practical concerns the way a lawyer lists arguments, sequentially building toward a conclusion already reached. She told him she would handle things the way she had always handled things. There was a pause. Then he said quietly that he was worried about her. She thought about the email in her coat pocket. She thought about the soil sample bores in the backfield. She thought about the word worried and what it meant coming from a man who had spent 11 months deciding how to profit from land he had told her was worthless. She told him she had work to do. She ended the call. She watched the hawk until it disappeared over the tree line, and then she finished her soup in the quiet that followed. It was on a Thursday morning in the fourth week that she finally opened her grandmother's room. She had been avoiding it. Not consciously, she had told herself the delay was practical, that she was working from the outside and clearing the accessible spaces first. But honesty, which Ruth had practiced all her life, even when it was uncomfortable, required her to admit she had been avoiding the room the way you avoid the last page of something you don't want to end. Agnes Whitmore had lived in this house for over 50 years. She had raised Lorraine here, tended the land, here grown old, here. The room at the end of the upstairs hall had been hers for most of that life, and it had been closed since Agnes died in 1983, and Ruth had not walked into it since she was a young woman helping her mother sort through her grandmother's belongings in the raw, disorganized grief of that first loss. She pushed the door open on a Thursday morning with her lantern in her hand. The room was dim and still and layered in dust. The curtains, once white, had gone the color of old paper and came apart at the edges when Ruth touched them, dissolving into fibers that drifted slowly to the floor. The bed was still made, the coverlet pressed flat by 40 years of empty air. On the dresser, a small oval mirror reflected Ruth's lantern light back at her in a circle of gold. She worked through the room carefully and slowly, the way you handle old things with attention, without force. She stripped the bed. She cleared the dresser surface. She worked through the closet, folding ancient clothes into boxes she had brought up from the kitchen, taking her time with each garment, the way you take your time with things that were once worn by someone you loved. She was nearly through the closet when her lantern caught the wall at the back. There was a door. Small, perhaps 3 feet high, set into the wall where the roofline sloped down to meet the floor. The kind of door that a child notices and an adult forgets. Ruth had to crouch to reach the handle, her knees registering their objection clearly, and when she pulled it open, the hinges moved with a slow and ancient resistance that suggested the door had not been opened in a very long time. The space beyond was dark and low storage under the eaves accessible only from this room. Ruth held the lantern in ahead of her and looked. Boxes. 5 or 6 of them, various sizes, pushed to the back of the space where the roofline was highest. And in the far corner, separate from the boxes, sitting on a folded blanket, as though placed there with intention, a wooden box. Handmade, dark with age, perhaps 16 inches long and 10 inches wide, fitted with a small brass lock that had gone entirely to rust. Ruth pulled the other boxes out first. Most contained what she expected: more clothes, some papers, 2 photo albums she set carefully aside and did not open yet, knowing they would require more than the practical attention she was allocating to this task. A box of old kitchen items wrapped in newspaper. She pulled the wooden box out last. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it downstairs to the kitchen table and set it in the light from the window. The brass lock had corroded through on one side, and when she applied gentle pressure with a flathead screwdriver from Earl's Tools, the hasp gave without resistance. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth that had been treated with something beeswax, she thought by the smell of it, were glass jars. Dozens of them, small and carefully sealed, each with a label written in the looping cursive she recognized immediately as her grandmother's hand. She lifted the first jar and held it to the window light. Seeds. She lifted another and another. She set them on the table one by one, reading each label as she went, and as she read them, she felt something building in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. Lunar iris. Last documented bloom 1962. Germination notes. See Notebook 3, page 41. Heartwood vine. No known wild specimens after 1970. Requires acidic soil, partial shade. See Notebook 2, page 17. Ghost orchid variant. Cameron property recovery. 1968. Extremely limited seed count. Handle with care. See Notebook 1, page 8. There were more. Label after label in Agnes's precise hand, each one noting a name, a date, a cross-reference to a notebook. Ruth counted 37 jars before she stopped counting and began instead to look for the notebooks. She found them beneath the oilcloth at the bottom of the box. 4 of them, small cloth-bound, their covers dark with age, but their pages, when Ruth opened the first one with hands that were not entirely steady intact, dense with her grandmother's handwriting. Dates, observations, diagrams, measurements, growing conditions, soil compositions, companion planting notes, germination techniques for seeds that required specific scarification or cold stratification or extended darkness. Pollination records. This was not a farmer's journal. This was the systematic work of a scientist. Agnes Whitmore, who everyone had remembered as a quiet woman who kept a good garden, had been doing something far more deliberate than keeping a garden. She had been walking into fields scheduled for logging and taking seeds from the understory plants before the chainsaws arrived. She had been visiting farms bought out by agricultural corporations and asking to look at the old fence lines where heritage plants survived. She had been preserving with methodical and patient care the genetic material of plants that the industrializing American landscape was erasing one by one. She had been doing it alone, without recognition, without resources beyond what she had on this 41 acres, without anyone apparently who understood what she was doing or why. Ruth read for 3 hours without stopping. The last entry in the fourth notebook was dated September of 1983, 3 months before Agnes died. The handwriting was slower in this entry, more deliberate, the hand of someone conserving energy. I am not certain this work will continue after me. Lorraine does not have the knowledge, and I have not taught her well enough. That is my failure, not hers. Ruth is busy with her own life. I don't want to be a burden by asking too much of either of them. These seeds will wait. Seeds are better at waiting than people are. If the right person finds them, the work will continue. If not, at least I did what I could with the years I had. Some things are worth attempting, even when completion is uncertain. I believe in this land. I believe in what's in this box. I believe that things the world has decided are finished, sometimes simply haven't found the right conditions yet. I hope whoever finds this reads carefully. Everything they need is in these pages. Ruth set the notebook down on the kitchen table and pressed both hands flat against the wood surface and looked out the window at the overgrown fields for a long time. Her grandmother had sat in this kitchen, had looked out this same window, had worked for years in those fields on something she believed in alone, without asking for acknowledgement or help. Ruth thought, I am 75 years old. I was expelled from my son's house to make room for his ambitions. I drove 4 hours to a ruined property everyone told me was worthless. And I am sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table reading the life's work of a woman who preserved the seeds of extinct plants for decades and trusted that someone would eventually come. She thought about what that kind of trust required. She did not cry. She was past the kind of grief that requires tears. But she sat with the weight of it for a long time, the particular weight of understanding something too late and too early at the same time. Then she opened Notebook 3 to page 41 and began to read about lunar iris. She chose a section of the cleared land nearest the house where she could monitor it closely. Agnes's notes specified soil composition in precise ratios. The existing soil would need amendment, she had written, as this species requires exceptional drainage combined with deep moisture retention, a paradox most soils cannot resolve without help. Ruth ordered materials, sharp sand, specific compost, a particular clay amendment, and coordinated with Earl on delivery, which required some creativity given the condition of the access road. She worked the amendments in by hand, one small section at a time over 5 days. At 75, working soil was an act of negotiation between intention and physical capacity, and she negotiated steadily. Earl offered to help with the heavy work. She let him carry the bags of amendment to the edge of the plot and thanked him for it. The turning and working of it she did herself. When the soil was ready, she planted. Agnes's instructions were exact on depth spacing, watering, schedule, and protection from late frost. Ruth built cold frames from salvaged window glass she found in the barn, cutting them to size and fitting them over the planting beds with the careful improvisation of someone working with what is available. She watered on Agnes's schedule. She watched the frames in the morning and the evening and the middle of the day, which she recognized as not quite rational, but which she couldn't stop doing. 15 days passed. On the morning of the 16th day, Ruth walked out in the pale early light with her coffee, not expecting anything, and stopped. The smallest imaginable thing. A thread of green, perhaps a quarter inch, curled slightly at the tip, emerging from the soil at the precise location where she had placed the third seed in the second row. She looked at it for a full minute without moving. Then she got down on her knees in the dirt, both knees slowly, with the deliberate placement of someone who knows this is going to cost her something and has decided the cost is worth it, and she put her face close to the soil and looked at that small green thread. 40 years in a sealed jar. 40 years in a dark box in a room no one opened. 40 years of waiting in the absolute patience of something that simply requires the right conditions. She thought about Agnes. She thought about Lorraine. She thought about herself at 75, kneeling in Ohio soil in the early morning. She did not try to stop the tears. They were not the tears of grief. They were something else, the release of a pressure she hadn't known she had been holding, a pressure that had been building since the morning at Daniel's kitchen table, since the email she found in the drawer, since every small erasure of the previous 3 years. These seeds had not given up. They had simply waited. By the end of the day, 11 more had germinated. Earl called his friend Dr. Sylvester Holt 2 days later. Holt was a plant biologist at Ohio State University, a tall, deliberate man in his late 50s who drove out to the property in a truck almost as battered as the road required and walked through Ruth's planting beds with the expression of someone trying very hard not to leap to conclusions. He asked to see the jars. He asked to see the notebooks. He sat at Agnes's kitchen table with the notebooks open in front of him and read for an hour without speaking. What he said when he finally looked up was simple, Mrs. Calloway, I need to make some calls. The verification process took 10 days. Other experts arrived. They were careful and professional and clearly working to maintain scientific detachment. But Ruth could see it in their faces, the suppressed excitement of people who have spent careers studying things the world considers lost, suddenly confronted with evidence that loss is not always permanent. The lunar iris was confirmed. Genus and species, the exact cultivar documented in botanical records from the 1950s, thought extinct for over 60 years. The heartwood vine cuttings Ruth had propagated from Agnes's germination notes showed the distinctive cellular structure that matched the 1967 herbarium specimens. The ghost orchid variant was still germinating slow as Agnes had noted it would be, but showing the right characteristics. Dr. Holt told her she was holding one of the most significant private botanical collections in the country. He also told her carefully that word was going to spread quickly and that she should prepare for attention she might not want. He was right on both counts. Ruth had allowed Earl's granddaughter Cassidy, a practical 16-year-old who had been helping Ruth figure out the property's internet connection, to photograph the lunar iris blooms and post them to a gardening forum. The post was simple. My grandmother preserved these seeds in 1962. They were thought to be extinct. They bloomed this week. There was a photograph of the flowers, and there was a photograph of Agnes's jar label in her careful cursive handwriting. Within 48 hours, the post had been shared thousands of times. Within a week, Ruth's phone was ringing with a frequency she found genuinely alarming. Botanists, conservation organizations, a journalist from a national publication, a documentary filmmaker based in Columbus. She answered the call she chose to answer. She declined the rest with a courtesy that was genuine and a firmness that was non-negotiable. Then Wade Harmon arrived. She knew who he was before he introduced himself. She had developed over 75 years a reliable instinct for men who arrive wearing the right clothes and carrying the wrong intentions, and Harmon confirmed himself within the first 2 minutes. He represented Agricor Inc. He had driven from their regional office in Columbus. He was polite in the careful way of someone who has been trained to be polite and is applying that training deliberately, and he presented an offer of $1.2 million for the property, a significant increase from the $800,000 they had offered Daniel 11 months ago, an increase that acknowledged the changed circumstances without acknowledging why those circumstances had changed. Ruth listened to him complete his presentation without interrupting. Then she told him no. He had expected this. He moved smoothly to the second position. He understood her attachment to the property. He wanted her to know that Agricor had deep respect for the botanical significance of what she had found. They had resources, greenhouses, research infrastructure, a staff of professional conservationists that could do far more for the preservation work than a single individual managing 41 acres alone. Ruth told him she had been managing things alone for most of her adult life, and she had found it sufficient. He told her that the property sat within a corridor currently under federal highway development planning, and that while Agricor certainly hoped to resolve this through a willing sale, the County Planning Commission had broad authority under eminent domain statutes when it came to parcels within development corridors. The threat was professional and clean. which made it no less a threat. Ruth looked at Wade Harmon for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Thank you for driving out, Mr. Harmon. I'll show you back to your vehicle." She walked him to his car. She watched him leave. She went back inside the house and sat at the kitchen table where Agnes had sat and thought carefully and without panic about what she needed to do. What happened next became the part of the story that people later described in shorthand, the way complex things get compressed over time. But the compression loses what was most important about it, that Ruth did it herself. She made the calls. She used the contacts Dr. Holt had provided, and the conservationist who had reached out through Earl's network and a property rights attorney named Donald Fife in Columbus, who had been recommended by someone who had heard about the situation through the botanical community. She paid Fife's retainer from the proceeds of selling her late husband Gerald's pocket watch collection, 3 watches she had been carrying in her jewelry box since his death, pieces she had kept because she could not yet release them, and release now because this is what they were for. Fife was sharp and fast and deeply interested in the case. The National Heritage Seed Act provided a mechanism for emergency protection of sites holding documented genetic material of extinct or critically endangered plant species. The documentation Agnes had created, the notebooks, the meticulous labeling, the cross-referenced germination records, provided exactly the kind of scientific foundation the protection application required. Dr. Holt submitted the academic validation. Ruth submitted the application through Fife's office. The process moved with a speed that surprised everyone, including Fife, who later said he had never seen a heritage seed designation come through in under 3 weeks. The confirmation arrived on a Thursday morning by certified letter. The 41 acres in Franklin County was now a designated National Heritage Seed Site. Agricorp's eminent domain threat dissolved. The highway corridor would require rerouting. Wade Harmon did not drive out again. But it was a week after the designation and a phone conversation with Fife about finalizing the site protection documentation that something came out that Ruth had not expected. Fife mentioned with the careful tone of a man relaying information he considers significant that in the course of reviewing the property records, he had noted an irregularity. In the estate filing following Lorraine Calloway's death 5 years ago, the Franklin County property had been assessed and valued for estate purposes by an independent appraiser. The appraiser's firm had in subsequent years taken on Agricorp Inc. as a client. The valuation they had provided for Lorraine's estate was notably below market, even for undeveloped rural land at that time before any highway planning was known. And the estate attorney who had managed Lorraine's affairs, who had overseen the distribution that placed the property in the residual estate category, where it had sat technically in Ruth's name, but effectively unmanaged, that attorney's firm had since been absorbed by a larger practice that counted Agricorp among its corporate clients. Fife added one more detail. He had conducted a thorough title search through historical county records, including Muskingum County, where Agnes had resided before moving to the Franklin County farm, and had located a will Agnes Whitmore had filed there in 1979. Muskingum County records from that era had never been digitized and were therefore not visible in the standard electronic searches an estate attorney would run. It appeared that Daniel's attorney had done only a limited title search consistent with how an asset of minimal declared value would be handled. The will had sat in a physical archive unfiled in any system for 40 years. He said, "I'm not making any accusations. I'm noting what the documents show." Ruth sat with the phone at her ear and looked out the window at the field where the lunar iris was blooming, broad, pale purple petals that caught the afternoon light and held it flowers that had not existed in the world outside this plot of Ohio soil for over 60 years, blooming now because a woman had saved them and another woman had planted them. She thought about the valuation. She thought about the estate attorney. She thought about the email in her coat pocket from 11 months ago. And she thought about Daniel, who had arranged those estate proceedings, who had chosen that attorney, who had perhaps known or perhaps simply not asked. And she found that in this moment, the distinction between those two possibilities seemed very small. She told Fife to document everything. That evening, she stood in the garden as the light went long and golden across the field, and she looked at what 41 acres of neglected Ohio land had become in the months since she had arrived with 2 suitcases and a satellite phone. Cleared paths, amended beds, glass frames catching the last of the day's warmth. Rows of plants that had not existed in documented cultivation for decades now, rooted in her grandmother's soil putting out leaves and flowers with the quiet insistence of living things that have finally been given room. She did not feel triumphant. Triumph was too small and too clean for what she felt. What she felt was more like the moment when a long carried weight is set down and you finally understand how heavy it was, not because it is gone, but because you can feel your own body again without it. The sun dropped behind the tree line. The purple of the lunar iris deepened in the fading light, and the flowers seemed as Agnes had written in her notebook they would to hold a glow of their own in the dusk. Ruth watched them until the stars came out. Summer came to Franklin County the way it always comes to that part of Ohio, not gradually but all at once, as though the land had been holding its breath through the long uncertainty of spring, and finally released it in a single exhalation of heat and green and insistent proliferating growth. Ruth worked in the early mornings before the heat settled, and in the evenings when it lifted, and in between she planned and read and wrote. In the journal she had begun keeping not Agnes's kind of journal, the precise scientific record of a preservationist, but something more personal, the account of a woman who was still in the process of understanding what was happening to her. She had not expected company, but company came. The first was Gloria Fenwick, who arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in June driving a 10-year-old station wagon with a cracked windshield. Gloria was 78 years old, sharp-tongued, recently widowed, and had read about the property on the Botanical Society forum, where Dr. Holt had posted his verification findings. She had driven 40 minutes from her home in Granville because, as she explained without preamble, after introducing herself on Ruth's porch, she had been a master gardener for 30 years. Her children thought she was too old to be useful, and she was frankly furious about both of those things. Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Do you know anything about soil pH management?" Gloria said she had been managing soil pH since before Ruth's children were born. Ruth said, "The ghost orchid beds need attention." "Come on then." That was how it began. Margaret Webb arrived 2 weeks after Gloria. She had been a reference librarian in Columbus for 32 years and possessed the particular organizational intelligence of someone who had spent 3 decades helping people find what they needed in places they didn't know how to look. Within a week of her arrival, she had created a cataloging system for Agnes's notebooks, cross-referenced, indexed, and photographed for backup, that Dr. Holt later told Ruth was better than most university archive systems he had worked with. Rosa Tanner came in July and Dorothy Hines in August. Rosa had been a high school biology teacher in Zanesville. Dorothy had spent 20 years managing the operations of a large nonprofit before her children moved away, and her doctor started talking about assisted living with a frequency she found insulting. They arrived separately, found their way to the property through different paths, and stayed for the same reason. Here was work that mattered, and here was a place that understood that the capacity to do meaningful work does not expire at a particular age. None of them were paid. None of them needed to be told what to do for long. They brought their own tools and their own knowledge and their own specific accumulated competencies, and they applied them to the work the property required with the focused energy of people who have been waiting without knowing they were waiting for exactly this kind of purpose. The Heritage Seed designation brought university resources and graduate students, serious young people with good intentions and incomplete knowledge, which Ruth found a familiar combination. She taught them what Agnes had recorded and what she herself had learned in the months of working this land, and she was a demanding teacher which they respected more than they initially expected to. The property in late summer looked nothing like what Ruth had arrived to in April. The house was fully restored. Earl had managed a small construction crew. Through June and July, and the plumbing and electrical were modern now, and the porch no longer sagged, and the white paint was back on the farmhouse exterior, clean and present. The barn had been rebuilt into a workshop and classroom space with good light and a long central table around which 10 people could work comfortably. One evening in late August, Earl stood at the edge of the main garden bed after the day's crew had gone home. He had been there a few minutes before Ruth noticed him from the porch standing still, which was unusual for Earl, who was almost always in motion. She walked down and stood beside him and looked at what he was looking at. The heartwood vine had taken hold on the barn wall. The lunar iris beds showed the healthy, ordered abundance of plants well established in the right soil. The ghost orchid shade house glowed softly in the evening light. Earl said after a long moment, "My grandfather had a farm. Sold it in 1962. I always thought that was just something that happened." He paused. Now, I don't know. Ruth didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Earl picked up his toolbox and headed to his truck, and Ruth watched him go, understanding that some things don't require a response to be complete. It was on a Saturday in late September, the leaves just beginning their first hesitant turn, that Daniel came. Ruth saw his car from the kitchen window. The good car, the one she recognized. She watched him park at the end of the newly graveled drive and get out and stand for a moment looking at the property, turning slowly, taking in the restored farmhouse, in the cleared paths, in the greenhouse along the south wall, in the fields with their ordered wild abundance. She recognized the expression on his face from across the distance. She had seen it before, not on Daniel, but on the faces of people who have built a complete internal model of a situation and then encountered the actual situation and found the model inadequate. She finished her tea. Gloria was at the kitchen table working through a germination log. She looked up at Ruth's face and then out the window. She said, "Do you want company?" Ruth considered this. Then, "Let me start alone." Gloria said, "I'll be right here." Ruth went out through the front door and walked down the porch steps and stood in the morning light, while Daniel made his way up the path toward her. He was wearing ordinary clothes slightly worn at the knees. He looked like he had slept poorly for a considerable number of consecutive nights. He stopped a few feet from her. He looked at her work boots, her canvas jacket, her hands that had changed over the summer into something more capable looking than the hands he had last seen wrapped around a mug of tea at his kitchen table. He said, "Mom." She waited. He said, "This is..." He made a gesture that took in the property, the garden, the rebuilt barn, the greenhouse. "I don't have the right word for what this is." She said, "Remarkable is a word people have used." He said, "I was wrong. About everything, about what you were capable of, about this place, about what I did." Ruth said, "Why are you here, Daniel?" The directness was not cruelty. It was a courtesy, the courtesy of not making him wade through a longer approach to what he had actually come to say. He said, "The business is in a difficult stretch. Vivian and I, things are not good between us." It came out that she had been in contact with Agricor about the land before you left. Ruth said nothing. He said, "I found out through the legal proceedings. Fife's office subpoenaed some communications. She had contacted them before you, even before the conversation in the kitchen. She had given them information." He stopped. "I didn't know. I want you to know I didn't know about that part." Ruth looked at her son. She thought about what he had said and what he had not said. He had not said he was unaware of the Agricor offer, or unaware of the estate valuation irregularities, or unaware of the highway corridor. He had said he didn't know about Vivian's contact with them. The perimeter of his claim was narrow and specific, which meant the rest of the territory remained unaddressed between them. She said, "Come inside." They sat at the kitchen table, Agnes's table, where Ruth had read the notebooks, where she had made the plans that had become this property, and Gloria appeared long enough to put 2 cups of tea on the table and then disappeared with a discretion that Ruth appreciated and noted. Daniel looked at the photographs Ruth had put on the walls, Agnes in the field, Lorraine at the kitchen window, Gerald on the porch of the Hartford house in the early years. He looked at Agnes's notebooks, carefully stored now in archival boxes on the shelf Margaret had built into the wall beside the stove. He said, "I knew the land might have some value. With the highway planning, I should have told you." Ruth said, "Yes, I thought I was managing things. I thought I was protecting the family's financial position. I told myself you wouldn't want to be burdened with complicated property considerations." Ruth said, "That's a useful story." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, it is." He looked at his tea. "I'm sorry, Mom. I drove out here because I don't have anywhere else I know how, to be honest." Ruth thought about that. She thought about the boy who had held her hand at his father's funeral. She thought about the man who had threatened guardianship over his own mother at a kitchen table in April. She thought about the distance between those 2 versions of the same person and what had traveled that distance and whether any of it was recoverable. She said, "I'll tell you what I told the people who offered me money for this place. I'm not interested in transactions, not with Agricor and not with you." She picked up her tea. "But I'll make you an offer. Come on Saturday mornings. Work. Learn what this land is and what it requires. And over time, if you're paying attention, you'll understand something about value that you apparently weren't taught anywhere else." He said manual labor. She said meaningful work. There's a difference. He said, "And if I say no," she said, "then you drive home and we have the relationship we have which is to say almost none. He looked at his hands on the table. Ruth recognized the internal calculation happening behind his face, the pride against the need, the resistance against the recognition. She had watched him make difficult calculations his whole life. She did not rush this one. He said Saturdays. She said 7 in the morning. Bring boots. He came the following Saturday stiffly and self-consciously wearing new boots that still held their shape. Gloria assessed him from across the greenhouse with the expression of a woman reserving judgment while gathering evidence. Margaret was polite in the precise way that is not quite warmth, but is not hostility either. Ruth put him to work. She gave him work that required sustained attention and no particular expertise, clearing a new bed, turning compost, moving materials from one part of the property to another. The kind of work that tells you at the end of a day exactly what you contributed, which is a form of honesty that most professional environments deliberately avoid. He worked without complaint. He came back the next Saturday and the one after that. Somewhere in the fourth or fifth Saturday, Ruth watched him without his knowing she was watching, and she saw something shift. He had stopped carrying the self-consciousness. He was talking to Earl about the drainage project on the East Field with the engaged attention of someone actually interested in the answer, not performing interest. He was looking at the heartwood vine on the barn wall with the expression of a person who is beginning to see something rather than simply observe it. He was a long way from understanding what had happened between them. So was she. Forgiveness. Ruth had decided was not a single event but a slow process, and she was not going to perform its completion before it had actually occurred. But something was happening in the space where their relationship had nearly dissolved, and she tended it the way she tended the orchid beds, with attention, without forcing, trusting that things which are alive and properly cared for have their own timeline. Vivian called in October. The call came on a Tuesday evening while Ruth was writing in her journal. She answered because she had decided she would not avoid things that needed to be faced directly, even when the facing was uncomfortable. Vivian's apology was careful and correct. It addressed the contact with Agricor. It used language that had been chosen thoughtfully, that was genuine in its construction, if not yet fully arrived at in its substance. Ruth listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "I hear you, Vivian." She did not say more than that because more than that would have been untrue, and she had decided some time ago that the only thing she would offer forward was truth. The door was not closed, but it was not open either. It was simply a door, and time would determine what it became. In October, Gloria told her about the conference. The National Botanical Conservation Symposium was held every 2 years in Washington, D.C. This year's program committee had reached out to Dr. Holt with a specific request. They wanted Ruth to speak. Not about the botanical discoveries, though those would be part of it. They wanted her to speak about the broader story, the property, the inheritance, the process of what she had built here and what it meant. Ruth said no. Gloria said, "Let me tell you something." She pulled her chair closer and sat with the particular posture of someone who has decided to deploy the full force of their personality. There are women right now and men who are sitting in houses being made to feel like they're finished, who have been told their time is past, who believe it because everyone around them keeps saying it. You have a different story. You have evidence that they're wrong, and you're going to turn down the chance to put that evidence in front of the people who need to hear it, Ruth said. I said no, Gloria. Gloria said Agnes preserved those seeds for 40 years and trusted that someone would eventually do something with them. What are you going to do with what this year has given you? Ruth looked at her for a long moment. She said, "You're going to be insufferable about this until I agree, aren't you?" Gloria said, "I really am." They flew to Washington in November. Ruth, Gloria, and Margaret, who had appointed herself official documentation officer, and brought a well-organized folder of Agnes's photographs and botanical records. Ruth had never been comfortable with air travel and found at 75 that this had not changed, but she endured the flight with the same steady practicality she applied to everything and was relieved when it was over. The conference was large. 500 attendees, researchers and conservationists and academics and policy people, people who worked in the professional language of preservation and biodiversity and genetic heritage. Ruth stood in the lobby before her session and felt briefly the specific loneliness of being in a room full of people who all appeared to know exactly where they are and why. Gloria appeared at her elbow. She said, "You cleared 41 acres of Ohio wilderness alone with a hand fork." "This is a ballroom," Ruth said. The wilderness didn't have a microphone. Gloria said the wilderness also didn't have a standing ovation waiting on the other side of it. She was right about the ovation as it turned out. Ruth stood at the podium and looked out at 500 faces and did what she had done all her life. When confronted with things that required courage, she began at the beginning and she told the truth. She told them about the kitchen table in April. She told them about the email in the drawer. She told them about the drive to Franklin County on a spring morning with 2 suitcases and no plan beyond refusal. She told them about Agnes's box in the dark room under the eaves, about the notebooks, about the seeds that had waited 40 years for the right conditions. She told them about the 16th day, about getting down on both knees in the dirt, which was not comfortable at 75, and which she would do again without hesitation. She told them about Wade Harmon and his briefcase and his offer and his quiet threat, and about the attorney she paid for with Gerald's pocket watches, and about the designation that arrived on a Thursday morning and ended that particular chapter. And then she told them what she had come to understand. She said, my grandmother Agnes was not a scientist in any credentialed sense. She had no university affiliation, no research funding, no professional recognition of any kind. She was a woman on a 41-acre farm in Ohio who understood that the world was losing things it didn't know it was losing, and she made a decision alone without support, without any certainty that it would matter to try to save them. She did this for over 30 years. She did it because she believed the work was worth doing, even if no one else knew it was being done. She paused. When I arrived at that property in April, I had been told in various ways by various people that my time had passed, that I needed care rather than purpose, that I should accept diminishment as the natural condition of age. I had been given, without knowing it, 41 acres of extinct flowers in a grandmother's faith. And what I want to say to everyone in this room is this: the logic that writes off old things before examining them is the same logic that throws away seeds because they look like dust. It is the logic of impatience, and impatience is a very poor tool for conservation. The room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something true is being said. Things do not stop being valuable because they are old. People do not stop being capable because they have accumulated years. And sometimes the things that have been waiting the longest bloom most magnificently when they finally find the conditions they need. She stepped back from the podium. The standing ovation was, as Gloria had predicted, real. Ruth stood at the edge of the stage afterward, accepting the hands offered to her, answering the questions she could, deflecting the ones she couldn't, when she noticed a man waiting at the back of the line. He was older than the other attendees, moving slowly with the careful deliberateness of someone who has come a significant distance and intends to complete his purpose. He introduced himself as Warren Cutler, a retired notary from Muskingum County, Ohio. He was 81 years old. He had driven to Washington not because he worked in conservation or botanical science, but because he had seen the news coverage of the property and recognized the name. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced an envelope. It was old. The paper had gone ivory with age, and the edges were soft from decades of handling. On the front, in the handwriting Ruth had spent months reading in notebooks, were 3 words: for Ruth Calloway. He said, Agnes Whitmore brought this to my office in the spring of 1982. She paid the filing fee and left instructions. The envelope was to be held in my office and delivered personally to Ruth Calloway, but only under one condition. He looked at Ruth carefully. Only when she returned to the land, not before. Those were Agnes's exact words. Only when she returns to the land. He said, I've been holding this for 43 years. I retired in 1998, but I kept this in my personal files because I gave Agnes my word. When the news started covering what you'd done at the property, I knew the condition had been met. Ruth took the envelope with both hands. She did not open it there in the conference hall with 500 people in the room. She waited until she was back in the hotel, sitting in the chair by the window with the city lights of Washington spread out below her, Gloria and Margaret giving her the silence the moment required. She opened it carefully, the way you open something that has been waiting a long time. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Agnes's handwriting. The pen and strokes were firm and sure, not the slowed hand of the final notebook entry, but the full and certain hand of a woman in her 60s who knew exactly what she wanted to say. She wrote, Ruth, if you are reading this, you came back. I always believed you would. Not because you had to, but because you are the kind of person who goes toward hard things rather than away from them, even when you don't know you're doing it. I saw that in you when you were a girl in these fields. You were the one who always wanted to know why a plant grew where it grew. You asked the questions that mattered. I am leaving you something that the world doesn't know it needs yet. That is all right. The world often doesn't know what it needs until someone shows it. The land is yours by right and by temperament. The seeds are yours by blood and by care. Don't let anyone tell you that what I've gathered is worthless. It is not worthless. It is the most valuable thing I know how to leave behind. I don't know what circumstances brought you back to that land. I imagine it wasn't easy. The things worth arriving at rarely are. But you got there, and that is everything. With all my love across however many years this letter has traveled to reach you, Agnes. Ruth sat with the letter for a long time in the quiet Washington hotel room, while Gloria and Margaret said nothing, which was the exactly correct thing to say. She thought about Agnes writing those words in 1982, the year Ruth was 32 years old, busy with her own life in Hartford, entirely unaware that her grandmother was sitting in a county notary's office in Ohio, paying a filing fee, leaving a message across 43 years, or to a granddaughter she trusted to eventually find her way home. She thought about what it meant to be known that well by someone who had been gone so long, to be seen clearly enough that the seeing reached forward across decades and still recognized you when you arrived. She thought about the 16th day kneeling in the dirt. She thought about Gerald's watches. She thought about Fife's voice on the phone. She thought about Daniel in the lunar iris bed, looking at the dormant plant saying, I don't know how to answer that honestly yet. She thought about Earl standing at the edge of the garden at dusk, saying quietly, I always thought that was just something that happened. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. She set the envelope on the windowsill, and she looked out at the lights of the city, and she let herself feel the full weight of what Agnes had done. Not just the seeds, not just the notebooks, not just the will filed in a county archive, but this personal act of faith posted forward into the future, trusting that the right person would be there to receive it. Agnes had not been waiting passively. She had been preparing. For decades, in every way available to her, she had been arranging the conditions under which things she cared about could survive and eventually bloom. Ruth understood sitting in that chair that she had been one of those conditions. Gloria said from across the room, Was it what you needed it to be? Ruth said, It was more. What happened afterward, the video clips shared across the internet, the articles, the interview requests, the flood of messages from people who found the story through one channel or another. Ruth managed the way she managed most things, selectively, practically, and with her attention on the work rather than on the attention itself. She answered letters from elderly people who wrote that they had shown the coverage to children who had been treating them as liabilities. She answered letters from men in their 60s and 70s who said they had been watching the story of the land and the seeds and the fight against Agricor with the recognition of people who understood from their own lives something about being underestimated. She answered every one of those letters because they deserved answers. She declined the documentary proposals. She declined the speaking tour. She agreed to one long profile interview conducted at the property because Dr. Holt had persuaded her the botanical conservation community needed the story told in full detail. Agricor faced a Federal Trade Commission inquiry that winter. The lobby records around the highway corridor designation became part of a broader investigation into the firm's land acquisition practices in 3 Midwestern states. Wade Harmon left the company in January. Ruth noted this without satisfaction and without its absence. And then on a Saturday morning in late November, Donald Fife called with the final piece. Agnes's will, once submitted formally into the Ohio probate process with Fife's office managing the documentation, was determined valid and uncontested. The Franklin County property had been Agnes's to leave as she chose, and she had chosen Ruth. And that choice made in 1979, witnessed and signed and sealed, was now a matter of public record that no subsequent estate maneuvering could reach. The land had always been hers. Now the documents said so too. That Saturday, Daniel came as usual. He had been coming for 2 months, and the newness of it had worn away to something more genuine. He worked well. He had learned the names of the plants he tended. He had started asking questions that were not practical. Questions about what Agnes had been trying to do, about what the work meant. Questions that suggested he was thinking at a depth his April self would not have recognized. Ruth told him about Fife's call. She told him about the 1979 will and what it confirmed. She said it plainly and without editorial comment because she had decided that between the two of them, there would be plain speech or nothing. He was quiet for a long time. They were standing in the lunar iris bed, which was not blooming now. November was not its season, but which showed the healthy dead back of plants correctly dormant, resting in the ground, gathering themselves. He said, the estate attorney was mine, my choice. She said, I know. He said, I don't know how much I knew. He was looking at the dormant plants. I don't know what I told myself and what I actually believed. I don't know how to answer that honestly yet. Ruth said, that's a more honest answer than a complete one would have been. She said, I'm not asking you to have all of it resolved today. Neither do I. She looked at the dormant beds. Some things need a full winter before they're ready to grow again. He nodded once. Then he picked up his gloves from the post where he'd hung them and went back to the work he'd been assigned, and Ruth went back to hers, and they worked together in a silence that was nothing like the silence she had lived inside in his house. A silence that was simply two people present and occupied and beginning slowly the long work of finding a new language for something that mattered to both of them. Cassidy came by that afternoon with a friend she'd brought to see the garden. She was 16 and had posted a photograph that changed everything, and Ruth watched her walk the paths with the easy confidence of someone who understood that what grew here was extraordinary without needing to be told why. At one point, Cassidy stopped in front of the lunar iris bed and stood there quietly reading the marker Ruth had made with Agnes's original label. She didn't say anything, she just looked. Ruth thought, she'll remember this. In 40 years, she'll still know she was here and what it meant to be here. On a December afternoon when the property was quiet and the women had gone home, and Earl had finished his week's work on the new irrigation line, Ruth walked the paths alone. The garden was dormant and waiting in the honest way of things that know they will return. The lunar iris beds lay quiet under the mulch she had put down herself in October, following Agnes's winter preparation notes precisely. The heartwood vine on the barn wall had dropped its leaves and showed the clean architecture of its stems, the structure of the thing visible now that it had been stripped to its essence. The ghost orchid shade house was locked and still its inhabitants suspended in the slow metabolism of deep winter. She thought about the year, April to December, what she had arrived to and what was here now. She thought about Agnes, who had done her work in quiet and left it to be found. She thought about Lorraine, who had lived here in the last years of her life and perhaps never known what was stored in the room at the end of the hall. She thought about Gerald, whose watch collection had paid for the attorney who had secured the place she was standing. Small acts of provision rippling forward through time in ways that couldn't be predicted or planned. She was 75 years old in April. She was 75 years old now in December, which meant she would be 76 in February, which meant she was still here, still working, still adding up the slow accumulation of days that are the actual substance of a life. She had not proved anything to Daniel, though he was in the process of learning something. She had not proved anything to Vivian, though the door between them remained cracked open. She had not proved anything to Agricor or to the Meadowbrook Senior Living Facility, whose brochure was still somewhere in a file in Daniel's house. She had proved something to herself, and she had proved it to Agnes wherever Agnes was proved that the faith Agnes had carried forward across 43 years and sealed in an envelope and left with an old notary in Muskingum County had not been misplaced. The lunar iris would bloom again in spring. The ghost orchid was already established in the shade house, slow and extraordinary. The heartwood vine would put out its heart-shaped leaves in April and climb the barn wall with a renewed insistence that Ruth had come to recognize as biological conviction, the refusal at a cellular level to stop. She walked back toward the farmhouse in the fading December light. The windows were lit from inside, warm and yellow, exactly the color of a house that is lived in. The white paint on the exterior held the last of the afternoon sun. She climbed the porch steps. She opened the front door. Inside, Agnes's photographs were on the wall. Agnes's notebooks were on the shelf. Agnes's letter was in the envelope on the windowsill where Ruth had placed it the night she came home from Washington, and where it would stay because some things deserve to remain visible. The kitchen smelled of the soup Ruth had put on at noon, which had been cooking all day, in the way that food cooked in a house that has time for things to develop properly. Ruth hung up her coat. She went to the kitchen and stirred the pot. She looked out the window at the darkening field where the seeds were doing what they had always done best. In the spring, the lunar iris would bloom again. 20 botanical gardens across the country were now growing divisions of the original plants, insurance against loss, the expansion of a single grandmother's faith into something that could not be erased by any single failure or any single generation's indifference. Agnes had wanted the work to continue. It was continuing. Ruth had wanted to matter. She mattered. Those were not small things. In fact, Ruth had come to believe they were the only things that mattering. The plain and stubborn fact of contributing something real to the world's continuation was the whole point of the time a person was given, regardless of how many years that time comprised. She sat down at the kitchen table. She opened her journal and picked up her pen. She began, as she always began, at the beginning of the day, recording what had happened, what she had observed, what the land required, and what it had given. But tonight she found herself writing something different. Not observations, not plans. She wrote out loud, Agnes waited 43 years to give me a letter that said I was seen. I spent 75 years becoming the person she saw. Neither of us knew the other was doing it. That is the thing about faith. It doesn't require coordination. It only requires that each person does their part in their time as fully as they are able. She set down the pen. She looked out the window at the Ohio dark settling over the field, the stars beginning their slow appearance above the tree line. Inside, the lamp cast its circle on the page, and outside in the beds under their winter mulch, the seeds were gathering themselves, storing what they needed, preparing in the dark and quiet for the only thing they had ever been designed to do. Come spring, they would bloom, and so Ruth understood, would she?